On January 27, 1967, 3 astronauts climbed into a spacecraft at Cape Kennedy, Florida, for a routine test. The rocket wasn't fueled. The pyrotechnics were disabled. NASA classified the entire procedure as non-hazardous. 17 seconds later, all 3 of them were dead. What killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee wasn't some freak accident nobody could have predicted. The warnings had been piling up for months. The astronauts themselves had been begging NASA to fix the spacecraft. Grissom was so frustrated that he actually ripped a lemon off a tree in his backyard and hung it on the Apollo flight simulator at the Cape. So why didn't anyone listen? And how did the worst disaster in NASA's history end up being the reason we actually made it to the moon? To understand what went wrong inside that capsule, you need to know who was sitting in it. Gus Grissom grew up in Mitchell, Indiana, a small limestone quarry town where his father worked as a railroad signalman. He flew 100 combat missions in Korea piloting F-86 Sabres, earned an engineering degree from Purdue, and became one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts selected in 1959. He was the second American in space, launching on a suborbital flight aboard Liberty Bell 7 in 1961. That mission nearly ended his career when the capsule's hatch blew open after splashdown and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Grissom insisted the hatch malfunctioned on its own. Some people at NASA weren't so sure, and that suspicion followed him for years, but Grissom didn't let it stop him. He commanded Gemini 3 in March 1965, becoming the first person to fly in space twice. He was so involved in the Gemini spacecraft's design that other astronauts called it the Gus-mobile. By the time Apollo came around, Deke Slayton, the head of the astronaut office, later wrote that Grissom would have been his first choice to walk on the moon. Sitting next to Grissom in the center seat was Ed White. Born in San Antonio, Texas, to a career Air Force general, White was basically engineered for this job. He graduated from West Point in 1952, earned a master's in aeronautical engineering from the University of Michigan, and nearly made the U.S. Olympic team as a hurdler. On June 3, 1965, White became the first American to walk in space during Gemini 4. He floated outside the capsule for 23 minutes on a 25-foot tether, using a handheld gas gun to maneuver himself around. When Mission Control told him it was time to come back inside, his response became one of the most quoted lines in spaceflight history. He said it was the saddest moment of his life. And then there was the rookie. Roger Chaffee grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where his father, a former barnstorming pilot, built model airplanes with him at the kitchen table. Chaffee made Eagle Scout, got his engineering degree from Purdue just like Grissom, and as a Navy pilot flew 82 classified photo reconnaissance missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The guy was flying U-2 spy planes over Cuba at the height of the Cold War. At 31 years old, he became the youngest American ever assigned to a spaceflight crew. He'd never been to space before. Apollo 1 was supposed to be his first trip. There's a quote from Chaffee about flying that tells you everything about who he was. He talked about being up at 45,000 feet on a clear night with a full moon, looking up at the sky and telling himself he had to get up there. That hunger was real, and it was about to cost him everything, because the spacecraft these 3 men were trusting with their lives was a mess. The Apollo Command Module, designated Spacecraft 012, was built by North American Aviation at their plant in Downey, California. It was an entirely new vehicle, not an upgrade of the Gemini capsule, and by late 1966 it was drowning in problems: faulty glycol pumps, leaking thrusters, coolant glitches, exposed wire bundles running through the cabin. The software lagged so far behind the hardware changes that the training simulators were never current. Astronauts would practice procedures in the simulator that didn't even match what the actual spacecraft did. In late 1965, Major General Samuel Phillips led a team to investigate what was going wrong at North American. His findings, documented in what became known as the Phillips Report, laid out chronic failures in quality control, scheduling, and cost management. Phillips sent a strongly worded memo directly to North American's president. The report was damning, and NASA leadership buried it, Congress wouldn't find out it existed until Senator Walter Mondale forced it into the open after the fire. But the two design choices that sealed the crew's fate were deceptively simple. First, NASA used a pure oxygen cabin atmosphere. This was a carryover from Mercury and Gemini, where the weight savings justified the risk. On the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, the cabin was pressurized to 16.7 pounds per square inch of pure oxygen. That's actually higher than normal sea-level air pressure. In that environment, materials that would barely smolder in regular air become violently flammable. A cigarette would burn to ash in seconds. Second, the hatch opened inward. NASA had rejected North American's original proposal for an outward opening explosive bolt hatch because they were worried it might accidentally blow during flight, the same thing that happened to Grissom on Liberty Bell 7. So instead, they went with a three-piece plug design that was held shut partly by the cabin pressure itself. Under perfect conditions, opening it took at least 90 seconds. Under any kind of internal overpressure, it was physically impossible to open. The cabin pressure would literally hold the hatch shut. Grissom knew the spacecraft was in trouble. He told a reporter the problems were coming in bushelfuls. When someone at a press conference asked what would make Apollo 1 a success, his answer was blunt. He said a successful mission meant all three of them getting back alive. The crew even posed for a gag photo sitting around a model of the capsule with their heads bowed in mock prayer. The inscription read that it wasn't that they didn't trust the engineers, but this time they'd decided to go over their heads. On January 22, 1967, Grissom made his last visit home before the test. He walked into his yard in Texas, picked a large lemon off his citrus tree, and told his wife Betty he was going to hang it on the spacecraft. He kissed her goodbye. He hung that lemon on the Apollo flight simulator at the Cape. 5 days later, he was dead. January 27, 1967. The test was called a plugs-out integrated test, designed to verify that the spacecraft could run on its own internal power with ground cables disconnected. The Saturn IB rocket wasn't fueled. The pyrotechnics were disabled. Officially, the test was classified as non-hazardous. Nobody even positioned fire equipment at the base of the pad. The crew's secretary, a woman named Lola Morrow, who privately referred to the program as Project Appalling, remembered the three astronauts as unusually quiet that afternoon as they crossed the gantry walkway at Launch Complex 34. At 1 in the afternoon, Grissom climbed into the capsule, followed by Chaffee, then White. Almost immediately, Grissom complained about a sour smell in his suit oxygen loop, something like buttermilk. The count was held while technicians took air samples. They never found the source. It had nothing to do with what came next. The count resumed, and the cabin was sealed and purged with pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch. Then the communication system started failing. A stuck microphone on Grissom's loop and interference across the network meant ground stations couldn't hear each other, let alone the crew. Grissom's frustration boiled over. He snapped into the microphone asking how they were supposed to get to the moon if they couldn't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings. The count was held again at 5:40 p.m. At 6:30 p.m., instruments recorded a brief voltage surge in AC bus 2, likely a short circuit somewhere in the spacecraft's wiring. 9 seconds later, at 6:31 p.m., someone inside the capsule, likely Grissom, shouted a single word: "Fire!" 2 seconds of scuffling. Then Chaffee's voice came through clear enough to understand. He reported a fire in the cockpit. Those words are burned into NASA's institutional memory. After nearly 7 seconds of silence came one final garbled transmission. The crew reported a bad fire and said they were burning up, ending in what everyone listening described as a cry of pain. At 6:31 p.m. and 19 seconds, just 15 seconds after Chaffee's first report, the command module's pressure vessel ruptured from the heat. All telemetry stopped 3 seconds later, 17 seconds. From the first alarm to total silence, 17 seconds. The fire had started in the lower left equipment bay beneath Grissom's couch, near a bundle of silver-plated wires running through the environmental control unit. Flames raced along nylon debris nets and Velcro patches that engineers had stuck across the ceiling for convenience. in a pure oxygen environment at 16.7 pounds per square inch. Those ordinary materials became rocket fuel. White, in the center seat, immediately started the emergency procedure to open the inner hatch. Forensic analysis later showed his harness buckle was still closed and the hatch ratchet had been partly turned. He was still working the mechanism when he lost consciousness. The rising cabin pressure made the inward opening hatch impossible to move. Grissom unstrapped himself and tried to reach a cabin vent valve on the burning left wall. He never made it. Chaffee stayed in his right-hand seat and kept communicating, exactly as procedure required. The fire killed all three of them in 15 to 30 seconds through carbon monoxide inhalation and toxic fumes. Their hearts stopped from oxygen deprivation to the brain. The extensive burns found on their bodies were largely inflicted after death. On the gantry outside, pad leader Donald Babbitt ordered emergency egress the instant he heard the alarm over the communication loop. Babbitt and technicians Jim Gleaves, Steve Clemens, Henry Rogers, and L.D. Reese charged into the white room surrounding the capsule. Then the spacecraft ruptured outward and hit them with a wall of flame and heavy gray smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands. 27 pad workers were treated for smoke inhalation that evening. Working by touch, taking turns running out for breathable air, the crew needed roughly 5.5 minutes to remove all three hatch layers. The outer boost protective cover was warped by test wiring and wouldn't budge without a special tool. The middle ablative heat shield hatch came next, then finally the inner pressure hatch. When Babbitt shone his flashlight inside at approximately 6:36 p.m., he couldn't speak. He choked into his headset to Deke Slayton in the blockhouse below that he could not describe what he saw. The heat inside the cabin had exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The astronauts' nylon spacesuits had melted into the spacecraft interior. Their bodies weren't removed until the early morning hours of January 28, more than 7 hours after the fire. If you're getting something out of this, hit that subscribe button. We cover stories like this from the history of space exploration every week. NASA Administrator James Webb convinced President Lyndon Johnson to let the agency investigate itself rather than face an independent commission. Deputy Administrator Robert Siemens established the Apollo 204 Review Board on January 28th, chaired by Floyd Thompson from Langley Research Center, and including astronaut Frank Borman, spacecraft designer Maxime Faguet, and combustion expert Robert Vandola. The board spent months producing a 3,000-page final report released on April 5, 1967. They couldn't pinpoint a single ignition source, but they identified the conditions that made catastrophe inevitable. A sealed cabin pressurized with pure oxygen, hundreds of square feet of combustible nylon netting, Velcro, and polyurethane foam within inches of electrical wiring, silver-plated wires vulnerable to chafing, flammable ethylene glycol coolant, a hatch that could not be opened against pressure, and zero fire rescue provisions on the PAD. The board's conclusion cut deep. They found that in its focus on the difficult challenges of spaceflight, the Apollo team had failed to give adequate attention to basic questions of crew safety. The congressional hearings were brutal. Senator Walter Mondale went public with the Phillips report, accusing NASA of hiding evidence of known problems from lawmakers. The political pressure to cancel Apollo entirely was real. But Frank Borman, the astronaut on the review board, saved the program. Testifying before both chambers of Congress alongside Alan Shepard, Wally Schirra, and Deke Slayton, Borman told the senators to stop the witch hunt and get on with the work. He said the cause of the fire wasn't negligence. It was a failure of imagination. Nobody at NASA had believed that a test on the ground could be just as deadly as a mission in space. Congress kept funding the program, and NASA rebuilt the spacecraft from the ground up. The redesign took 21 months and it changed everything. The inward opening hatch was replaced with a single outward opening quick-release crew hatch made of aluminum and fiberglass that could be opened from inside in 7 seconds. 7 seconds. Compare that to the 90 seconds minimum of the old design that couldn't open at all under pressure. The launchpad cabin atmosphere was changed from pure oxygen to a 60-40 oxygen-nitrogen mix, transitioning to pure oxygen only as the vehicle climbed to altitude. The astronauts' nylon suits were replaced with beta cloth, a non-flammable Teflon-coated fiberglass material. Aluminum tubing and high-pressure oxygen lines was swapped for stainless steel. Solder joints in coolant lines were armored. Plastic switches became metal. Engineers identified and corrected 1,407 wiring problems across the spacecraft. Pad 34 itself got fire-resistant paint, water spray systems, and a slide wire emergency escape route. The next crewed Apollo mission, Apollo 7, commanded by Wally Schirra, launched on October 11, 1968. Every system worked. The human cost of January 27th didn't end with the fire. Deke Slayton, watching from the blockhouse, called it the worst day of his life. Frank Borman went home and got drunk, something the man almost never did. He later admitted he and the other astronauts ended up throwing glasses against the wall, like a scene from an old war movie. Memorial services were held in Houston on January 29th and 30th. On January 31, 1967, Grissom and Chaffee were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in plots less than 100 feet from Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, America's first powered flight fatality back in 1908. President and Lady Bird Johnson attended. Ed White was buried at the West Point Cemetery, his alma mater. NASA officials had pressured his widow Pat to agree to an Arlington burial, but Borman stepped in, knowing it was against White's wishes. The families later sued North American Aviation. Betty Grissom's wrongful death case settled in 1972 for $350,000. Pat White and Martha Chaffee each received $125,000. Chaffee's 8-year-old daughter Cheryl grew up to spend a 33-year career at Kennedy Space Center. There's one detail about the Apollo 1 crew that almost nobody knows, and it's become one of the most quietly beautiful traditions in spaceflight history. Before the fire, Grissom, White, and Chaffee had named 3 navigation stars in NASA's Apollo star catalog as a private joke. They called them Navi, Dinosis, and Regor. Navi is Ivan spelled backward, Grissom's middle name. Dinosis is second backward, a nod to Ed White being Edward II, and Regor is Roger backward for Chaffee. After the fire, every Apollo crew that followed used those same star names on their navigation charts. It was a quiet memorial written into the constellations themselves. Those names still appear on later mission star charts. On July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the surface of the moon, they carried an Apollo 1 mission patch with them. They left it in the lunar dust beside the Eagle lander, along with medallions bearing the names of Grissom, White, and Chaffee. The fire that nearly killed the moon program rode to the moon itself. The concrete launch pedestal at Pad 34 still stands today at Cape Canaveral, abandoned and overgrown. 2 plaques are mounted there. One asks visitors to remember the crew not for how they died, but for the ideals for which they lived. The other reads Ad Astra Per Aspera, a rough road leads to the stars. Before the fire, Gus Grissom gave a quote that ended up becoming his epitaph. He said that if they died, he wanted people to accept it. He called spaceflight a risky business and said he hoped that if anything happened, it wouldn't delay the program. He believed the conquest of space was worth the risk of life. It delayed the program by 21 months. But those 21 months produced a spacecraft that carried 12 Americans to the lunar surface and brought every single one of them home. The 3 men who died on Pad 34 never reached the moon, but they're the reason anyone else did.